Okay, everybody, welcome back to part 3 of our lecture series on blood vessels. And where we left off in part 2, we had been talking about the capillary beds. And before that, we talked about how the arterioles supply the blood to our capillary beds. We said they're surrounded by smooth muscle, which can vasodilate or vasoconstrict, regulating the flow of blood through the capillaries. One thing though, notice here that capillaries also have sphincters just before the capillary starts. This is bands of smooth muscle that can constrict and actually inhibit blood flow to that organ. There's usually an arteriole that travels down the middle of a capillary bed like that. So blood not only can continue along this arteriole, but cross the capillary bed and go straight to the venule. The venule is where all our capillaries merge into the larger blood vessel called the venule. It's analogous to the arteriole, but now you can see the difference in color is implying that oxygen was released, waste products were picked up. And so now the venule, the venous side of our cardiovascular system, is what brings the blood back to our heart. Again, we don't completely deoxygenate our blood, but it is lower and we need to prime it and put as much oxygen in it as possible. Okay, so we're gonna look at how we do that. So this brings us to our veins or the venous system. This is, again, it's what's transporting blood back to our heart. Capillaries drain into the smallest veins called venules, and then those venules converge to form the smaller veins that exit the organs. Those merge into larger vessels, and then we get our veins, and then our final two veins are inferior and superior vena cava that both connect to the right atrium, bringing blood to the right side of the heart, which will then start the pulmonary circulation. And they're very large radius because they offer little resistance to blood flow. Think about all that blood flow that went down to your toes. It's got to be conducted against gravity to your heart. So we can't afford to have much resistance there. And because there's little resistance and they're large diameters, at any one time, they can store a lot of blood in them. We don't have the continuous movement through veins like we do with the arteries. And so without that continuous movement, then you get, the veins can kind of hold on to blood. We call them capacitance vessels because they have the capacity to hold blood, right? Or a blood reservoir. This is why if you nick a vein, if you cut a vein, you get a lot of blood. That you bleed a lot because they just hold so much blood. And we're going to look a little bit at how that happens. Right? Slide. There it goes. That shows you the different percentages that different blood vessels can hold, right? So you have in the systemic system, right? Sometimes when I pause, it's because I see my internet connection is unstable. So I just pause to hopefully that goes by. You can see in the systemic system, the arteries hold about 13% of your blood. The arterioles about 2%. But the veins can carry about 64%. So again, how does that translate? At any one time in your body right now, 64% of your blood is found in your veins. Okay, so again, that's why they're the capacitance vessels or blood reservoirs. All right, so venous return, blood returning back to the heart, right, to the right side of the heart so that it can then go into pulmonary circulation. Okay, so venous return, that's the volume of blood entering each atrium per minute. Okay, and venous return also occurs from the pulmonary circulation through the pulmonary vein, right, to the left side. But again, It's also dependent on the pressure gradient. The driving pressure is actually low due to the frictional losses. So remember, we saw this before, but I added some numbers here. So at the aorta, we said the pressure, mean arterial pressure is about 93. Okay, absolute pressure, again, it's about 120, 100 over here. As we move away from the left side of the heart, because of frictional losses, you're losing pressure. Okay, you're losing pressure along the way. Because of that, you're losing flow, I should say, because of the frictional losses. That increases resistance. So by the time you get to the veins, the pressure is like 17 millimeters of mercury compared to 93. And right at the opening of the atrium, it's about 0. But that's a pressure gradient, 93 to 0. This is the reason why blood flows from the left side of the heart to the right, because the left side of the heart is very high pressure, the right side is low. And so that's why you always get that circulation. Okay, it doesn't ever reverse. Okay, but you can inhibit the blood flow at the heart. So if you had a leaky atrioventricular valve, right? So that means if this is leaky, when the ventricle below contracts, that means blood, instead of all being conducted out the arteries, it would leak back into the, so that would cause a higher pressure, more than 0, right? So pressure increases, your pressure gradient decreases. So between 93 and 0, that was 93. If this went to 10, now it's 83. So that's going to reduce your venous blood flow. Okay, and blood then gets dammed up in the venous system. And this is something that can cause congestive heart failure. Congestive heart failure, just the inability of the heart to be able to continue to efficiently pump the blood because the pressures are changing in there. Okay, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But so suffices to say here, again, the heart can't pump enough blood to meet the body's needs. So if the pressure is reducing and you have less blood flow to the heart, okay, because you have a lower pressure gradient, and we said the blood pools up in the venous side, it's not getting to the heart, that means that there's less stretch in the heart. And remember, we said more stretch causes the heart to contract harder. So less blood flow means less blood in the ventricle. Less blood in the ventricle means a weaker contraction, and less blood being ejected, less stroke volume, less cardiac output. And over time, the heart just can't pump enough blood. It doesn't mean the heart stops working or has a heart attack. Congestive heart failure just means its inability to continue to pump blood. Okay. So what factors enhance venous return? Well, I show you a lot of them here. One has to do with the cardiac contraction itself, right? So the higher the pressure at the systemic side or at the left side, the lower the steeper gradient is going to be. So that's going to cause that. The sympathetic system can induce venous vasoconstriction. So it's not as significant as in the arteries and arterioles because there's a thinner layer of smooth muscle, if you remember from anatomy. So the ability then for venous to contract, it is there, and we actually saw it when we talked about syncope when you faint, and the veins will dilate. And so one of the ways that they reverse is then they will, to get you back to homeostasis, they will constrict, increasing the blood pressure. Okay, so when you have a big drop in blood pressure, your veins then will vasoconstrict, and then that'll help raise blood pressure. Another one is skeletal muscle activity, and along with that is the effect of the valves that are found in the veins. So let me go to the next picture, and I can explain that to you. So between many of your skeletal muscles, is where your veins run through. And the reason is because, again, the veins don't have a thick layer of smooth muscle, but if your veins run between your skeletal muscle, when you contract your skeletal muscle, then you put pressure on the vein and that causes it to constrict and it acts like a pump, right? So any blood that's down here in your foot, okay, it's got to go against gravity to get up to your heart. And we said that it doesn't receive much influence from the heart pump. Okay. But when you start moving around and you contract your skeletal muscles, that squeezes the vein and squishes the blood. So blood will want to go up. It wants to go down here, but it is inhibited by a valve. So veins have valves in them, much like your semilunar valves in your heart. Arteries do not. Arteries don't need them. Because again, when pressure gets applied here, blood wants to squirt in both directions, but if it went back down, then you wouldn't have the efficient movement of blood in one direction. So the vein valve stops it from going any further down. So any blood that gets squirted upward goes above this valve. And then the next time you contract your muscles up here, this portion of the blood instead it will get caught by this valve and continue to move upward, right? So it's just kind of the stepwise movement of blood through your arms and your legs, okay, just by moving them around. That's why if you take a long airplane ride, you really should at least get up and walk. If you can't get up and walk, move your ankles around so that you're engaging your skeletal muscles and it helps keep the blood flowing through your venous system. Okay. I mentioned the respiratory activity. I can't remember if I have a slide on it. No, I don't. Respiratory. So once that blood leaves your legs or your arms and gets into the inferior vena cava from your legs anyway, and through the abdominal area, you really don't have muscles surrounding those veins to squeeze them to pump it up. But what happens is just from your breathing, inhaling and exhaling, can cause a push-pull of the blood through the inferior vena cava. So when you inhale, okay, you expand your thoracic cavity, that reduces pressure. So pressure is lower in your thoracic cavity and it's higher in your abdominal cavity. So that causes a high pressure in the abdominal, low pressure in the thoracic. Fluid moves from the air at high pressure to low. So it pulls the blood upward. When you exhale, the pressure gradient shifts, wants to push the blood down, but you have valves. Valves won't go, the blood won't go past the valves. So the next inhalation, you bring it up past the next set of valves and so on and so forth until it comes all the way through your inferior vena cava to the right side of your heart. Okay, I put a video on Canvas that explains that. Okay, and even just the ventricular contraction of the heart, when it contracts, it kind of pulls on the AV valve, and that can actually cause a slight pressure difference in the atrium to slightly drop below zero. And that causes a little bit of extra movement through there. That's cardiac suction. All right. There we go. So we discussed a lot of things that influence venous return, and these flow charts just kind of sum it up. So remember that the first thing that acts on venous return is the cardiac output, okay? So the amount of blood being pushed around the cardiac system every minute. We already talked about that's the value of stroke volume, okay? Stroke volume, the amount of blood with each contraction. So that influences cardiac output, right? Remember, stroke volume then is influenced by end diastolic volume, how much blood actually fills the ventricle before you're ready to contract it out. End diastolic volume occurs because of venous return. Okay, so now we looked at what factors affect venous return. Okay, so this is everything that we just talked about. Well, blood volume affects that, and that has to do with how much water is in your blood, how much salt. Remember, salt influences water, right? How much your system is able to pick up the extra fluid in your interstitial fluid, which we'll talk about in the capillary lecture. Okay. We just said the respiratory pump, how efficient that is to pull the blood up through the inferior vena cava, right? How efficient your skeletal muscles. Again, if you're sitting around, you're not doing much, you're not influencing venous return. So you have to move your skeletal muscles around, especially if you're sedentary. Just wiggle your ankles around will help a lot. Okay, we do a sympathetic nerve control. We can vasoconstrict. That'll increase pressure, right? Increasing the pressure gradient, which makes more venous return, which means there's less venous capacity. Again, how much blood is just being held in the veins. Oh, sorry, my dog scared me. I'm trying to mute. Atlas. Okay. He was really concerned about cardiac contraction and things like that. Anyway, so go through, this is a summary of everything we just went through. If you can go through each of these and explain it, how it impacts venous return. And then when we studied the heart, we looked at these things, end-diastolic, stroke volume, cardiac. This is how you need to put everything together. Okay, and there's more to put together. Let's put more together. Okay. So what about determinants of mean arterial pressure? Okay, we said earlier in the lecture, part 1, I think it was, the two things that determine mean arterial pressure is cardiac output and total peripheral resistance. Okay, well, we learned things that affect cardiac output. Atlas. Okay, that was heart rate. That was stroke volume. Right? Well, what affects heart rate? Your parasympathetic and sympathetic activity. What affects stroke volume? We just looked at this, venous return. What affects venous return? Volume, respiratory activity, your skeletal muscle activity, cardiac suction. Okay, so again, this is just stepping you through one at a time to put all of this together. So when you take mean arterial pressure and you get a value that isn't right, these are the types of problem solving you go through. Okay, well, is it effect of the cardiac output? Let me listen to the heart rate. No, heart rate's normal. Maybe it's stroke volume. Okay, let's hook them up to a ultrasound so that we can see end diastolic volume. Well, if that's off, what's going on with venous return? Is there something going on with their respiratory activity? Oh, they have pneumonia. They're not able to fill their lungs and change that pressure as well. Right, so that's where you can go. We just looked at resistance. That was influenced by arteriolar radius. This is the one we really talked about. You looked at, what about the metabolic controls, those chemical reactions? What about the, or maybe actually, well, it is the activity of the organs. That really gets influenced by your skeletal muscle activity. So you can go one by one through that. I said blood viscosity doesn't change a lot, but it can. The number of red blood cells, if you're anemic, right? That could change blood viscosity and the total peripheral resistance. So all of these things are really important. You've really got to put this all together. Okay. Next one. What about how does our cardiovascular system sense when blood pressure is off? And then what does it do to bring us back to normal? So that has to do with these baroreceptors. There are, remember when we talked about mechanoreceptors earlier in the semester, and I said those were things that respond to physical pressure. And then I said there's a subcategory called baroreceptors. So this is them. These are the receptors that respond to the pressure of the fluid in your cardiovascular system. Okay, so what I want to do here, just to give you an idea of where our baroreceptors are, I'm going to stop sharing this one, and I'm going to share again the. So you've got your heart, okay, and the aorta branches off, and you get branchings off of that, the brachiocephalic. You get, this guy's going to go around like this. You get the carotid arteries branching off. Right, here's your head. Okay, and then you get another branch going to the left subclavian, right? That person is taking physiology and they're really happy. So these are your carotid arteries. That's one. Here's the other one, right? And all of a sudden they'll swell up right here. There's a little swelling, and this is where the baroreceptor is located. It's got another one on this side, baroreceptor. Okay. You also have a baroreceptor right at the beginning of the aorta as well. So again, what these are doing is baroreceptors are able to sense the pressure of the blood. They get stretched as well. They sense that pressure, and so that can send a signal to your brainstem, right? The medulla oblongata. Right, where we had that cardiac rhythmicity center. So I'm going to stop sharing this guy. You get the idea. You can probably find much better pictures in your book, but you get the idea. There we go. So that's called the carotid sinus and the aortic arch receptor. So these are when blood pressure, in this case, it's saying when it becomes elevated. Those receptors sense that, and then their rate of firing increases, right? When there's more stretch, that's higher pressure. Atlas! He just ran outside, okay. Sorry, you can fast forward, I'm sorry. So that goes to the cardiovascular center. Remember, that's the medulla oblongata. So those are nerve cells that can come along, decrease the sympathetic nerve activity, decrease sympathetic vasoconstrictor nerve activity, because our blood pressure is elevated. We're going to increase parasympathetic nerve activity. We want to lower it. So we do that by decreasing the heart rate. That's parasympathetic. We do that by decreasing the stroke volume, right? We vasodilate the arterioles, and especially if it's really high, the venous vasodilation. All of those things lower pressure, right? They do that by lowering cardiac output, lowering the total peripheral resistance. Your response is your blood pressure decreased. Okay, what if it gets too low? It's falling below normal. Well, then there's less firing in those baroreceptors in the carotid arch, or the carotid artery and the aortic arch, right? So those sensory nerves have a lower rate of firing. The medulla oblongata picks up on that. Will then increase the sympathetic cardiac nerve activity, right? And cause vasoconstriction. We're going to increase our heart rate when we do that. We're going to increase our stroke volume. So here's the vasoconstriction. That increases cardiac output and total peripheral resistance. And now our blood pressure is increased again. So again, this kind of thing, when you work in the medical field and you take somebody's blood pressure, right, this is a step-by-step thing you need to understand, because if somebody is not able to adjust their blood pressure, then you know something's wrong. And so now you can step through and try to pinpoint what's wrong. Okay, so again, usually you can do this in a healthy body. When blood pressure goes up, within 10 minutes it should go back down. And we kind of did that, fast-tracked it a little bit in the lab. We ran in place for a while, and then we saw if we could bring our blood pressure back close to normal within a few minutes. That really gives an idea of fitness, and fitness in your cardiovascular system. Okay, so I think that's the last slide. Nope, here we go, sorry. But again, those flow charts are really helpful for you to put all of this together. If you just learn the parts and you're not able to put it together, you're not fully gonna understand a cardiovascular system. Here, this is kind of some extra stuff. You know, could be good extra credit questions, I don't know. But there are other receptors around the body, and some of them we get into later, like the chemoreceptors that are sensitive to oxygen and CO2. Actually, I'll learn more about those when we do respiration. And so I'll let you kind of look through that. There are just receptors all throughout your body to just help bring us back to homeostasis. Okay, what happens when you have chronic high blood pressure? 140/90 chronically, that's called hypertension, right? And this is, we're still kind of learning what causes hypertension, but it's really, really common in this country, unfortunately. Hypertension is separated into two things: primary hypertension and secondary hypertension. We call it primary when again, it's a high blood pressure, and it's probably a variety of reasons, and we don't really know what they all are. Okay, secondary hypertension accounts for about 10% of all the hypertensive cases. It usually is caused by another problem to the unknown primary problem, unknown primary problem. So things like renal hypertension. This might have to do with if you know that you have high salt levels, and so therefore now the kidney isn't responding correctly, right? Or your endocrine system isn't responding now, or your something's going on with your nerves. So hypertension, a big problem in this country. And stress levels, usually a variety of unknown causes. A lot of it has to do with stress, and we still don't understand how stress fits into all of this, right? So the complication of hypertension can cause a lot of things. So if you don't control your blood pressure over time, this list can be your future: congestive heart failure, stroke, heart attack, so on and so forth. So you can see the list of problems that can occur if you don't control your blood pressure. And blood pressure is one of the easiest things to monitor over time. You can pick up a blood pressure monitor at CVS, Rite Aid, whatever, get a coupon, spend $20, and it can save you hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical bills in the future and save your life. Really important. Here's hypotension. This is when your blood pressure is usually below 100/60. So again, not enough blood is filling the vessels, and so you're probably not getting enough blood to your organs, right? Orthostatic hypotension can be really common, pastoral. We looked at this a little bit already. Again, it's from if you're laying down for a long time, maybe we're all doing this during the pandemic, you're hanging out in your bed a lot, going to class in bed. When you stand up real fast and you get low blood pressure, you get dizziness. So that gravitational shift in blood occurs because you move from horizontal to vertical. But chronic hypertension, you know, could be occurred because of circulatory shock. And so if that occurs, it's because your blood pressure falls so low that now your tissues, your organs, they'll start to go into failure, right? Because they're not getting enough of the oxygen and nutrients that they need. And so hypovolumic shock is just by low blood volume. So something's going on where you're not keeping your blood volume up. You probably need an IV. Cardiogenic shock is the heart isn't functioning properly. That could be due to congestive heart failure. We talked about that already. People who are at high risk for congestive heart failure, people who are 65 and older, African Americans are, people who are overweight, or those who have had a heart attack. Men actually have a higher rate of congestive heart failure than women do. So if you're in a high risk category, again, get a cheap blood pressure monitor. You don't have to spend much, and just watch your health over the years. Okay. Vasogenic is something's going on with the vasoconstriction or dilation, right? You're not able to maintain homeostasis there, or something's going on with your nerves in the parasympathetic or sympathetic division. All right, so that is, yep, the end of the cardiovascular system. Well, actually the end of the blood vessels. In the next lecture, we're going to talk a little bit more about capillaries and how exchange actually takes place. All righty, thanks everybody. See you in the next video. Sorry about Atlas barking, but you know, it's COVID conditions.